In this video, I'm going to talk about the starter motor removal and rebuild. This is from an M57 engine from a 2008 BMW X5 30SD. Pretty standard starter motor. Getting access to this is pretty hard work. So I'll talk about how to get that out. The reason why I'm rebuilding this is that this is working perfectly okay, but because all of this is open to the elements, this all just fills up with gunk. The carbon from the brushes will coat everything, and all the moving parts need to be re-oiled, etc. And when you do that, it'll just last forever, because there's always going to be loads of brush left on it. That really isn't the thing that fails. These things generally fail just because it's so full of gunk that they just stop working, and if you re-grease them, they're basically as good as new afterwards. Getting access to this, the way this sits in the car, so if I was looking from the front with the hood open, I've got two bolts that hold it on. They are E12 Torx. So either use that or a 10mm socket will work fine. The bolts come in from the rear and they go through the bell housing, which is that bit in there. So they'll go through the bell housing and then they'll screw into that. There are two electrical connections at the back here. There's the big red battery cable, which is connected to that one there. That takes a 13mm socket. And then there's the one down the bottom here, which is the one that activates the solenoid and makes the thing run. That takes a 10mm socket, so you'll need to remove those, and then you'll need to remove both of the screws that hold it in, and then the thing can come out. The problem with this, and I'll show you in a moment where this is, it's buried way down below a whole bunch of stuff. I'm doing some work on the high pressure fuel pump at the moment, so I had to drain the coolant and remove a whole bunch of coolant hoses that sit over the top of this thing. I couldn't even see it before I did all of that. And still it was pretty hard work getting the thing out. I took it out from the top because I'd removed all those coolant hoses. The workshop manual talks about removing it from the underside of the car, so removing the underfloor paneling and removing these from underneath. The transmission bell housing sort of goes out that way. You can get access quite easily to the bottom one here. You can see that from the underside of the car. And you'll need a really long extension, probably just one simple swivel joint and your socket on the end of that, and that can get access to that down the left hand side of the transmission. This one to the top here you can't see, but you can reach your hand around from underneath pretty easily and find that, but you'll need probably at least two swivel joints like this and a pretty long couple of extensions, and you'll have to muck around with that to be able to reach around here and put that on there and be able to get that off from underneath. And then there's a whole bunch of cords and stuff that sit over the front here. You'll have to get your something in here to get those off. Again, looking at it from underneath, that looked like a bit of a nightmare. From the top with everything removed, that wasn't so bad. And then with those removed, this should, by the workshop manual's instructions, be able to be taken down underneath the car. I've seen video online with people who have removed this from the top without even removing the intake manifold, and I take my hat off to them. You obviously can do it, but being able to try and get it back in there and safely seat it properly and get everything connected afterwards is going to be pretty hard. But I'll show you what that looks like in the car, and I guess you're just going to have to do your best job. So this is where the starter motor lives, down the back here. They got the two screws, so you'll be accessing in. The top one is there, so you'll have to reach around and go down the side of the transmission down here. The other one is there, which you can easily see. And everything would sit underneath here, and I've removed a whole bunch of coolant hoses and everything that live down here. So I can see all of this. There's the big one that goes along here, plus a big pipe that runs down the side here and connects a whole bunch of these coolant hoses. Now I've got access to it. I've got the big red cord, which is the one that's going to connect. There are two of those. Not sure if you can see that. They will be connected to that one that has the 13mm nut on it. And there's another one down there which is buried down here. Actually, it's that one there is the 10mm one that would have connected. But the whole thing sits down underneath here, and it's pretty hard to get access to. But what the book talks about is taking it down that way once everything is removed. So to get access to the bottom, well, there you can see just a single swivel joint comes down the left-hand side of the transmission, which is fine, but you'd need a couple of them to go over the top of that part of the bell housing there to get access to the ones at the top. You can see the connection points on the starter solenoid are just there, so you can get your hands up in there, but getting a wrench onto those and undoing them is going to be fairly tight from the bottom. And I'm assuming, that I didn't bring it out this way, but I'm assuming from the workshop manual that there is sufficient room to bring this out down here. Disassembly of the starter motor is reasonably easy. First thing you want to do is just disconnect the electrical connector from the solenoid that goes to the starter motor itself. 13mm socket, take that off and disconnect that, and then we need to remove the 3 screws here. As you can see, I've replaced 2 of those. These things, because they're a T25, tend to round over because they're corroded and get stuck in there, so I've had to drill 2 of these out. It's probably the hardest part of the whole job, to be perfectly honest. And once you remove those, then we can remove the solenoid. And so with those 3 screws removed, the solenoid will now come loose. It'll want to spring load towards the rear because there's a spring inside. We can just take that off. You'll see the plunger on the inside. That spring you can just keep to the side, that just lives in the middle in there. And now to get this off, the easiest thing to do is to put it on its end like that, because the forks inside will then push this up, and then you can just pull that straight off. And if you look down in here, you can see the little lever on the forks, and when you move that, that's when when the solenoid pulls it rearwards against that spring pressure when you turn the key, that's the thing that is going to pull that that way, which forces this forward, which does that, which then engages the flywheel to turn the thing in the same motion. When it moves rearward, it makes contact, so this thing then gets power to drive the motor. So it pulls it rearward, disengages, and then the motor will turn. To disassemble the body, leave these 2 screw connections connected for the moment. What we want to do is remove these 2. They're a 7mm socket. Remove those and pull those 2 big screws out. And with those 2 screws loosened, we can just pull those both out. And from here, don't just pull the casing off. I find it's easier to grab hold of this rear casing here and pull the motor out like that. Now I've pulled this apart and cleaned everything out, and you can see I've re-greased things, etc. But that will leave the rest up the front, and then from there we can then pull the front cover off. It might leave the gearbox in there, or it might take it out. If it stays in there like this, then we're just going to, that little rubber grommet that holds everything in there into the casing, that can be pulled off, that can be separated, and now we can pull out the whole gearbox and everything in there. And the way this works, that's the casing. It's full of permanent magnets. The motor obviously sits at the back. The drive of the motor goes into a planetary gearbox in there, and when it slots in like that, and that's the thing that reduces the RPM for what actually comes out the front. Once we get this to here, we can pull off the gearbox, and the way you do that, just get a screwdriver, and you can see there's little metal tabs here with a little dot in it. That's the thing that's holding it on. If you push each of those rearwards, then it'll open up your gearbox. Again, you can see that I've re-greased everything. Pretty simple just to clean all that up. I'm just going to put that into a big bucket of solvent, blow all the gunk and everything out with compressed air. Each of the gears, they can be pulled out. They've got a little needle bearing on the inside that runs against the shaft, so you can clean all that out, re-grease all of that. In addition to that, this is the shaft obviously that runs forward and aft. I'm going to again immerse this whole thing in solvent, blow all the gunk and everything out with compressed air. Whilst I'm using grease in this part here, I'm only going to use oil on the shaft, so I'm going to do a bunch of oil and run this through back and forth, as well as on these helical splines at the back here. So everything's nicely oiled. I wouldn't use grease because it'll gunge it up and this thing won't move correctly, so oil is the way to go with that. It's a little thing that runs around here, put a little bit of oil on that, but basically clean everything up as well as that thing there. And when you're putting this back on, it only goes on one way. You're just looking at all the little dots and make sure they line up correctly, and just rotate that thing around until it goes in the right spot. And then that just pushes straight on like that, ready for installation. On the front housing, again, immerse in some solvent, clean it all out. There's a needle bearing at the front in here, so again, give that a good clean out, and then put some oil in that, ready for installation. The back here, do not pull this shaft out because it's going to pull the brushes out, which is going to be a complete pain to try and get in. We're just going to leave those in place. And then what I'm going to do is unscrew these two screws at the back here. And once they're off, that cap will come off, and on the underside of that, again, I've cleaned all this out because this was just full of old grease and garbage. The little horseshoey thing that holds onto the shaft, that can come out. There's another washer. And then this thing can come off. There's a little seal here, which is a thing that seals the cap there. So that can come off. And then you've got the shaft here. So again, there, the brushes in there. Don't pull it out because getting those in is a real pain. Clean all this up. I wouldn't be putting this in solvent. I would be just cleaning these up. Maybe I just used a toothbrush with it a little, with it angled like that, and just cleaned everything off with some solvent, and then wiped it, and then cleaned everything up with compressed air. Same again with these gears and everything at the other side. Don't get solvent and everything in here. There'll be carbon left over from the brushes as well as inside here. Just blow all of that out. And then when you want to install this, we're going to put this thing back over the top. You got the, note the orientation, this thing's going to go up the top up here. Then our washer, obviously I've re-greased everything before putting everything back together. That goes over the top, and then those two screws go in place, and that's what we're going to push into the housing for assembly. To put all this back together, the first thing I'm going to do is put the gearbox section and the front section into the casing. The front bit is the bit with this notch, that one goes at the back. And this needs to be in the correct orientation. You'll notice it's got these little notches here that put everything in the right position. There are 3 of these horizontal ones and 1 sort of vertical one. So the horizontal ones go into these wide notches in here, and you need to find that one there. There's only one of those, and that's the one that's going to slot onto that one there. So put that in there like that and slot that in place, and that will rotate around like that. That's obviously going to be going in there once we put everything inside, and then we can slot this in place. And that just slots on. And then what I'm going to do is sit that on its end like that, and I'm going to put the motor in. And when the motor goes in, obviously we'll need to engage the gears at the bottom end. It'll just take a little bit of wiggling, so we just push that in place, align the slot here for the rubber grommet here. I'm just going to wiggle it back and forth, and eventually it will slot into place. And once everything's nice and flush, everything's in the right position, and then I can put the 2 big long screws in. With the solenoid and the plunger, again, easiest way to do that is because the fork lever there, if we push it down, you can't get it on. If it's up like that, so if you put it on its end, that thing will just sit straight over the top. Before you put this on, I'm going to clean all this up, and I'm not going to immerse it in fluid or anything, especially the solenoid, but just wipe all that clean, put a light coating of oil on that. And then once we're there like that, I can put the spring on, and then I need to orientate this correctly, so that one where we pulled off the connection point is going to be at the bottom. And then I can put those 3 screws in. Then finally, we're just going to put that connection on at the back, put the washer and the nut on, and then we'll be good to go to test it. And to test the starter motor, I need to connect a positive from a battery to the main positive terminal up here, which would normally be connected to the battery. The ground to anywhere on the casing here. And then we've got a 3rd positive, which is the one that's going to be the one that turns the thing on. That's just a wire there, and I'm just going to touch that on the positive, and we're going to check this thing works. There we go.